I've changed the title of my presentation several times, so you see this is quite a rather work in progress on how to theorize the concept of intersectionality. Because during my work on the interconnection of anti-Semitism and sexism, which was basically referred to the works of critical theory, during that work I realized that intersectionality, which the concept that I became to know from my feminist theory work, that intersectionality actually has so much to do with the relationship between the universal and the particular. And so this is what I would like to focus here in that paper. I would like to focus on that relationship by particularly referring to how Horkheim and Adorno analyzed anti-Semitism and sexism as two isms that are interrelated ideologies, and so to me this seems to be an early account of intersectionality on a macro level of society formation. So critical theory views, and this is really particular, and I think we should keep that in mind also when theorizing intersectionality. Critical theory views anti-Semitism as a key to understanding society. Not the only key, but a major key. Another key is gender relations or social relationship to nature and class relations. Oh, these are viewed as key moments for an understanding of society. So already in the authoritarian personality, Adorno talked about what he called the anti-emancipatory syndrome, and in that anti-emancipatory syndrome he included anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, nationalism, ethnocentrism, and today I would include also, of course, homophobia and transphobia. So we see that this might be an early account of intersectionality, and of course intersectionality as a concept, both theoretical and political, has its roots in black feminism and in feminism of color, but otherwise its development is not entirely apart from critical theory, and this not only because Angela Davis, who is a pioneer in conceptualizing intersectionality, she herself identifies into critical theory, but I would say she is prone to dissolve the universal into a number of special interests, and thus the mediation between the universal and the particular at times gets lost. And I think this is the very relationship which is so central to a conceptualization of intersectionality that is really critical. So in contrast to this, I want to suggest a conceptualization of intersectionality that is oriented towards the older critical theory, and which I would call the intersectionality of ideologies. The point that I would like to make is that in the writings of the older critical theory, a form of intersectionality is prepared, though of course not named that way, but it is prepared, that does not dissolve the universal into a variety of special interests, and that does not one-sidedly focus on identity formation, but which offers us a possibility to really rethink our own premises on the relationship of universal and particular, especially with regard to gender relations, with regard to ethnic relations, and on a maybe broader level, with regard to the relation between society, individual, and nature, to name that broad constellation within which Horkheim and Adorno situated gender relations, as well as anti-Semitism, as well as ethnocentrism, and so on. So this is what I would like to focus on in the next couple of minutes. Conceptualized that way, intersectionality may be termed applied dialectics, I'd say. It focuses on the relationship of different social antagonisms that are not isomorphic, but those antagonisms show different accesses to social reality. Those antagonisms are different forms of association in one and the same society viewed as a totality. So critical theory starts from heteromorphic conflicts and views them nonetheless in a totality as different problem situations that are altogether not outside capitalist mode of production and reproduction. So applied dialectics means that the terms are kept open and that they are in a constant move. Dialectic reflects that there is actually a chasm between the term and the phenomenon, that the term and phenomenon are never identical, and this is also what you addressed. It is a critique on identity philosophy, which has very much to do with how subject formation is being viewed. So there's so much more in the phenomenon that the term itself cannot capture, cannot immediately capture. So many different and ambiguous meanings. The dialectical term, and this is the aim of the dialectical term, although also the dialectical term cannot cover that chasm altogether, but it tries to reflect on this chasm. And is therefore kept open. So if, for example, we talk about woman, we never mean just the female, but there are so many other moments too, like ethnicity, class, nation, and so on, and they all enter into different constellations. So the universal term is filled with meaning, and depending on the context, the one or the other may come to the foreground without dissolving the others altogether. So similarly, the social, for instance, is never just social, but it becomes the social only in the specific constellation with the individual, with nature, with the psychological, political, and economic moments. So there are many, many, many particularities that constitute the universal and vice versa. So there are key moments for understanding society, but still those key moments for understanding society need to be embedded in the whole and can be understood and captured only in this specific embedding. And for critical theory, the older critical theory, anti-Semitism and also sexism are two of those key moments for obvious reasons. Horkheimer and Adorno exemplified the dialectic of enlightenment, meaning why and how modern society could relapse into total barbarity. They exemplified this by a thorough analysis of modern anti-Semitism. But implicitly, they also refer to gender relations as key moment for understanding the dialectic of enlightenment. And the affinity, the deep affinity, which doesn't mean that it's the same, but it's an affinity between sexism and anti-Semitism is a topic in the dialectic of enlightenment that is easily overlooked, even though the authors at times make it quite explicit. And I would like to quote one passage from the dialectic of enlightenment. Yes. The explanation for the hatred of woman as the weaker in mental and physical power who bears the marker of domination on her brow is the same as for the hatred of the Jews. Women and Jews show visible evidence of not having ruled for thousands of years. They live although they could be eliminated, and their fear and weakness, the greater affinity to nature produced in them by perennial oppression, is the element in which they live. And the strong, who pay for their strength by their strained remoteness from nature and must forever forbid themselves fair, this incites blind fury. They identify themselves with nature by calling forth from their victims, multiplied 1,000-fold, the cry they may not utter themselves. Flora already addressed the importance of the mastery of nature for the subject formation. And here we see that this mastery of nature is actually shows the intersection of anti-Semitism and sexism. So Horkheim and Adorno open up that intersection of those two ideologies via the image of nature and the identification with nature. In a sexist and anti-Semitic society, both woman and Jew are ascribed a greater affinity to nature. And here we see that intersectionality is more than mere similarity between different forms of oppression. It is really about how the one permeates the other, how the one is in the other, and that there is a mediating moment that actually connects the two ideologies on a structural as well as motivational level. The relationship of nature and society is one of those major mediating moments, and nature itself serves as an ideological function in sexist and anti-Semitic context. And of course, this is a central insight of early feminist writing, but it may be unexpected to read this in the Dialectic of Enlightenment written in the early 1940s. But what actually is nature that women and Jews are identified with? In critical theory, the concept of nature is not unitary, and it does not recur onto an imagination of primal nature. What nature is and what is deemed natural is rather elaborated with regard to their meaning in society and meaning for the processes of association. Nature is not conceptualized as pre-social, but as deeply entangled in the social and historical dialectics of progress and regression, in the dialectics of enlightenment and myth. It cannot be reduced to a bipolar evaluation of good or bad, good or evil, and an idealization of nature is strictly opposed to. In this manner, the authors also view the mastery of nature. The focus is laid primarily on the domination of inward and outward nature, and civilization is primarily viewed under the aspect of renunciation, introjection, and suppression of instincts. Therewith, they follow Sigmund Freud's proposition that civilization is based on the permanent subjugation of the human instincts. Mastery of nature and formation of the subject are two interlocking processes. The separation of inward and outward is closely connected to active involvement with nature, meaning labor, with deep effects on the individual. The self learned about order and subordination through the subjugation of the world, we read in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. While labor and active involvement with nature is a precondition for civilization and cultural development, man himself increasingly resembles nature as dead material, because labor takes place under such alienating conditions, characteristic for advanced society. It is exactly this resemblance between men and nature where the Dialectic of Enlightenment becomes manifest. Individuals are entangled in the very domination to which they subject nature. They submit themselves to the alienated labor conditions that prevent any sensuous relationship and exchange with nature. The suppressed instincts find destructive ways of expression in ideologies that are all closely connected. Horkheimer calls that the revolt of nature. Revolt of nature in fascism, in anti-Semitism, sexism, racism, nationalism, ethnocentrism, and so on. So individuals develop idiosyncratic loathing against what they secretly feel attracted to, what they desire and long for, and what they unconsciously associate with happiness. And this is the hidden meaning in all those images in anti-Semitism and sexism, racism. There is a hidden meaning, a hidden promesse de bonheur, as Walter Benjamin would have put it. So these figures consequently appear as standing closer to nature. Western civilization has created several such groups that represent nature, like women, Jews, gypsies, migrants, and so on. And all of them are identified with nature in an ambivalent way. In the context of strict mastery of nature, being identified with it implies being excluded from the social praxis of subjectivation. And when nature is degraded to mere material, to be mastered, to be operated with, to be identified with nature becomes a verdict, and people who are identified with nature are at best pitied. They are deemed passive and objectified and dependent on more or less benevolent leadership. So identification with nature always also implies dehumanization. Individuals are treated like mere material in the face of totalitarian domination. And subjectivation, of course, takes place in the course of activity turned towards nature. In that activity, the self, the identical, purpose-directed, masculine character of human beings, as Horkheimer and Adorno call it in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, is actually erected. So it is about the production sphere and women being excluded from the production sphere with which Horkheimer and Adorno trace the exclusion of women from subjectivation. So let me quote one further passage from the Dialectic of Enlightenment. The man must go out into hostile life, must act and strive. The woman is not a subject. She does not produce, but looks after the producers, a living monument to the long-vanished time of the self-sufficient household. The division of labor imposed on her by the man was unfavorable. She became an embodiment of biological function, an image of nature, in the suppression of which the civilizations claim to glory lay. End of quote. So being excluded from the production sphere, more explicitly, I would say, from the source of surplus value, is also a major moment in anti-Semitism. Jews are regarded as non-productive, just as women's work is in patriarchal society is viewed as non-productive, closer to nature. Only that this division of labor, in Horkheimer and Adorno's view, is nothing primal, nothing natural, but a manifestation of domination. It is imposed on women and Jews. And of course, in this society, the acknowledged form of subjectivity is bound to this particularly restricted notion of productivity. This is why, in this society, Jews as well as women are denied the status of subjectivity. So this motive runs through the Dialectic of Enlightenment like Ariadne's thread. And there are a whole lot of passages that directly relate to subjectivity in connection with gender relations and identification with nature. And for drawing these connections, Horkheimer and Adorno have regularly been accused of reproducing the male gaze on women. But in fact, as I think, they were rather denouncing this gaze and reading the image of femininity as a mirror script. Consider the following passage. This is the last one that I will give you. No, that's the wrong. Here we go. Man as ruler refuses to do woman the honor of individualizing her. Socially, the individual woman is an example of the species, a representative of her sex, and thus, wholly encompassed by male logic, she stands for nature, the substrate of never-ending subsumption in the plane of ideas and of never-ending subjection on that of reality. Woman, as an allegedly natural being, is a product of history which denatures her. I would say this is, in this passage, this is really applied dialectics. One cannot put it more dialectically. So, and it is indeed a telling passage that gets to the very heart of the dialectic of mastery of nature. Firstly, it is not man per se, but man as ruler who refuses individualization to woman. Thus, individualization itself is a strategy of domination, just as the exclusion from individualization is. And then the passage says that the individual woman is socially turned into an example of the species. Only in completely being embraced by, 2 minutes, 2 more. Thank you. So only in completely being embraced by the male logic, and this means in being identified into categories that are actually not hers, only in that way does she represent nature. And nature in turn is nothing primal, but the substrate of domination. So Horkheim and Adorno do not actually reproduce the identification of woman with nature, as some critics would have it, but what they actually do is articulating the untruth of this identification. It is the result of human action in history that is socially perceived as natural, as primordial, thus as unalterable. And the way Horkheim and Adorno read the image of woman as nature is actually second nature, mediated immediacy, and viewed that way in immanent critique. The image of woman as nature becomes intelligible as culture falling back into nature. In this context, first nature itself is always already mastered, is nothing primal, but the result of the process of civilization. So it is evident to me that Horkheim and Adorno themselves do not view neither women nor Jews as nature, but to the contrary, as representatives of culture that relapses into the state of nature. Society so completely reified and alienated from its own possibilities that it resembles nature again. So against this background, the objections against critical theory that they would reproduce the male gaze onto women can hardly be maintained, I would say. Just coming back for a couple of two sentences, summing up and coming back to intersectionality. I think that the way anti-Semitism and sexism are analyzed and brought into a constellation in the dialectic of enlightenment prepares that particular view onto intersectionality. And the most important thing, I would say, is that they show that not only the universal is a sign of domination, but the particular itself. They don't juxtapose the universal as a sign, they don't juxtapose the particular as the good to the universal as the tyrannical. But they see both in a dialectical relationship, in an antagonistic relationship that can only be understood in their entanglement into the totality that produces them both. So also the particular that is being praised and emphasized in so many current notions of intersectionality. Also that particular is nothing good per se, is nothing primal, but, and we see, as we see in the images of woman and Jew, also that particular shows the whole brutality of domination. Thank you very much.